Welcome everyone to the Clay Seminars. I'm Linda Sorman and I'm joining you from NYU, which is located on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Munsee Lenape community, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. New York University acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. And with me co-hosting today is Claire Toomey.
Hello, I'm calling from London today. The Clay Seminars is a collective gathering formed through the alliance of NYU and the University of Westminster's research team at the Ceramics Research Centre. We are grateful and humbled by the civic opportunity of our educational institutes to support this series, and we invite a broad gathering of artists, curators, and arts organisations at all stages of their practice to join us and share in the seminar series.
Thank you so much for joining us. We are thrilled that you have come to us today for Fragments and Dissonance. And we can stop sharing that screen. Yes, and we're together here. And I am thrilled to be here with our three panelists, and I'd like to introduce them. Rose Simpson is a mixed media artist from Santa Clara Pueblo, New Mexico. Her life work is a seeking out of tools, as she says, to heal the damages I have experienced as a human being of our postmodern and post-colonial era. Her work engages ceramic sculpture, metals, fashion, performance, music, installation, writing, and custom cars. Khalil Irving is an artist born in San Diego, California, drawing from internet culture as, in his words, an everlasting feedback loop of my experience. He collages and collapses together digital and ceramic fragments, creating intricate, kinetic sculptural archives. Ramakan O.R. Wisters is an artist, in his words, making larger sculpture using shards, discarded, thrown out, dangerous, deadly, razor sharp, jagged, abandoned, eternal, worthless, marginalized, hard, unsympathetic. They represent, quote, the anxiety, anger, fear, bitterness, and hopelessness associated with white body supremacy. So it's my pleasure to be here with the three of you. When I was thinking about the theme of fragments and dissonance, I was thinking over the years of the conversations that I've had with people, and they always happen in snippets as we move from place to place. Each of you has connected with me in my practice, and your words and your experience as makers have really taught me and influenced the shape of conversations today and the ones that I've been having over the past years. I still remember a dozen years ago when Rose and I were teaching a class together at RISD, and we were talking about history, we were learning techniques. I was learning so much about how to handle clay and just the way of handling material so that it's in bits, in fragments, and that fragmentation is shown and embodied through the way that the shards aren't always hard. Sometimes they're soft and they're intimate and they're internal, and that is really visible and palatable in the work of Khalil Irving as well. And Ramakan is the newest person that I met right on the eve of the pandemic. We had a talk in a gallery, and just your understanding of that embodied experience of understanding the world through parts, through the physicality, and the way that you have worked with shards and fragments as part of a healing process for self, for community, in both textiles and other materials and ceramic has really been inspiring. And walking with Khalil Irving in the streets of Alfred and just watching him pick up bits of paper debris and just knowing that that's going to be part of a street painting and printing with that material and being able to bring immediate experience together with something that for historical time has been a way that human culture has held its history in a shard. And so when I was looking at the words that we'd each composed, we were all doing 200 to 300 words, I looked at what I'd written and refined, and then I looked back and I found this file with all the crossouts, and I thought that is another kind of experiencing fragments. And so I'll share some of those fragments that come through, not in the scripted language, but the bits that kind of spill over or shatter. Fragments are what can only be uttered in part. They disrupt notions of wholeness. They are not ideal. Clay, a shard, is a glitch in the system. It signifies showing breakage and fracture, the loss of function or a process gone awry. Understanding or experience the world in and through fragments is characteristic. It's part of the diasporic experience. We move through unhomed, out of context, and perpetually reaching back to my or our origins. What does it mean to build with what is broken, incomplete, or never whole? Fragments can be something left unsaid, a half-remembered song, or a historic fact. It can be a breadcrumb trail, things that lead us to something that is unexpected. The sharp edge of a fragment offers the potential to be incisive. It might cut through the status quo. Dissonance is productive friction. As I've been listening to music, this need to sustain and explore a note out of place, to remain in a state of unresolved tension, is to break from the expected. Dissonance offers tension. It sharpens the act of listening, the way one listens, inclusive of and inviting discord and dissent. Dissonance in ceramics drives artists to confront our emotions, often our pain, and as Claire Toomey has said to me, to question stories we are told about clay objects. And this makes me ask, how are shards, how is clay, how are we supposed to behave? Active in each of our speakers' processes is détournement, the situationist's method of destabilizing an existing artwork through reimagining and restructuring parts. In collaborative work like this conversation today, the counterpoint to fragmentation and dissonance is collective intention. And so I'd love to invite Rose B. Simpson to share her screen and to present her introduction to her work and thoughts.
Thank you, Linda. It's funny that you talk about our time together because you're one of the most influential people in the process of finding my voice as who I am now. You know, because my voice is always changing, but I often think about some of our conversations and how inspirational you've been in my life. And so I'm ever grateful. So being a part of this conversation with everyone is really exciting. And as a little bit groggy as I am this morning, I'm excited about our conversation. I always like to start talking about my work in context, and because we're always kind of building in relationship, we don't exist in a void. And so, you know, I have had the privilege of coming from a very long history of ceramic artists, and less than artists, but human beings who lived in an aesthetic relationship with life and spirituality in the Santa Clara Pueblo of northern New Mexico. And so I live here in my ancestral homelands. This image that I'm showing you is actually, on the left is my mother's work. And on the right is Margaret Tafoya, who is one of the most sort of iconic traditional potters of my tribe, who has since passed. And I wanted to show you because this is what I'm inheriting. This is the story. This is the visual language that I'm coming from. And a lot of it is has been around grace, I think, seriousness, around a really deep and thoughtful and conscious relationship with place. And my mother was given clay and started her own contemporary process of figurative ceramics and eventually bronze. And so thinking about our place in context in my own voice, being considering very deeply our relationship to all things, and also our very important specific perspectives, that we're all these facets of this reality. And in the facet and in that perspective of being that very singular facet of a whole, we are doing vital work, and our perspectives are incredibly important. I started doing this style of building called slab, where I threw the clay very thin and then tore it to build with it. Very intentionally building the framework to force myself to be very present with the process. The clay is so thin that if it's too wet, it can't hold up the next layer. And if it's too dry, you can't add the next layer. And so there's a really invested and compassionate way of approaching this building style where I forced myself to reveal the process very clearly to myself and then to accept it, to find a sense of acceptance in the process itself informing the final outcome. This is an example of two ways of building. The bottom is the coil style building, these faces that are not polished. They still sort of hold the fingerprint. And the tops are the slab pottery, and thinking about the vessel as nourishment, as the bringing of life, as we are the earth and also it that stands upon it. And in that style of building, finding grace, refinding that seriousness, and also finding compassion for that process and acceptance for what it might end up looking like. And then layers of adornment, and what does that adornment look like, and how does that aesthetic transform and represent self-worth or even pride in that becoming, in the subtleties of identifying self and becoming that fragment, that facet of humanity that's vital. And instead of lying to ourselves about where we are in that world, of being very, very present in that process of becoming. I started to adorn my pieces with more jewelry and found beads. And in that is sort of a reference to resourcefulness, even the beads being bits and pieces that we find and we identify as powerful or as aesthetically empowering. Throughout history, humans love beads, and this is a very innate, I think, part of cultural relationship. And this was one of my very first experiments with slab, and this is more of a life-size piece that's on a welded frame. And I really feel like in that, the consciousness of building from our sort of truth, our complex and very multifaceted and complicated truth, that the clay reads and can inform that emotional power, I believe. And in that, allowing it to speak in the way that it can inform this process, and also validate those very deep internal fragmentations of ourselves. So yeah, it's just a little bit of my work in relationship to this subject. Should we switch or?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much, Rose. And I'll ask Khalil Irving to take the floor.
Hello, thank you all for having me. My slides. Let's see, share my screen. Being asked to join today, it makes me think quite a bit about where I'm from and who I was born to in terms of my parentage and the lineage of ancestors that have lived before me. And most recently, all my ancestors have like collated and connected in St. Louis. This is an image of the St. Louis Arch, which is a monument that's 400 some odd feet in the air. And in the middle of it, you see the courthouse, one of the oldest buildings built in St. Louis, where historic case for Dred Scott suing for his freedom from being enslaved with him and his wife and his family. And unfortunately, we know that that did not occur. And so I think about the layers of history that are social, physical, and emotive within spaces that are occupied, and the constant transformation of an architectural environment in which us as humans are occupying or oscillating between the spaces of the structures built around us is a complicated it's a complicated facility that then you have to then renegotiate constantly with your senses and the other myriad of information that you're being bombarded with daily. Just to make some room, this is an image of Dred Scott, who died in the mid 19th century. And this is a sculpture of mine made in 2017.
Khalil, just to interrupt for a second, we're not seeing the image just change. So you might want to select the
How do we do that? Maybe I'll go back.
Yeah, I would reshare and then select your desktop maybe, so what you're seeing is what we're seeing.
Okay, let's try that. Now I'm not gonna say anything when I share the slides. How about now?
We see your desktop.
Okay, can you see this?
That's perfect, thank you.
Okay, so this is St. Louis. Now think about all the things that I've already said. This is Dred Scott, 19th century figure. Think about what I said, and then bam, this is a sculpture from 2017 that is combining motifs from hobbyists or kitsch production of the Meissen blue floral iconography that was made between the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. And the blue floral pattern is still in production, but in a different set of motifs. And I'm combining that with a thin sheet of ceramic that is trying to make the surface of that piece of clay look like newspaper. And so the issue and the problematic of understanding the things that we inherit versus the things that we're immediately interacting with or trying to decipher daily, and the things that we're trying to wrestle with emotively within our sensorial engagement, it is all trying to wrap into this sculpture at once. Thinking about clay as something that can occupy spaces, being of itself, like clay looking like clay being formed into a vessel, and clay being formed into something that is recognizable from life, but is not necessarily going to perform or function the same ways in which those objects were or are made. And so making clay exist as those three parts of itself, those three different, in some ways you could say, fragments of its possibility, but also its measure of itself, making them exist simultaneously is a kind of pressurized dissonance of people's understanding of what clay can be and what clay can do, but also the possibilities of invention that can exist within a material that has such a long history of being formed, but also being used as a means for industrial production, the evolution of industrial application within the world. And for me, it's just been a place to put so many things simultaneously in one. And so this sculpture from 2017 is a kind of manifestation of this collage that I made, where you have Royal Delft and Meissen in the background. You have my backdrop or my screen in the back distance. You have a lecture between Theaster Gates and Hamza Walker. And in this screen on YouTube, they're comparing a Kerry James Marshall painting of a young man to a 16th century or 17th century portrait of white Jesus. And then you have on the left, you have a set of garniture. And in the bottom, you have a white supremacist making a statement. And then you see comparatively to the judgment and surveying or surveyship of Black men being forced or sold into enslavement, or being checked and prodded for the NFL draft. And this comparative study is a way of thinking about violence against Black people in relationship to histories of violence, not just against Black people, but how appropriation and production can exist simultaneously and still someone can be at fault, but through the action, it may not be acknowledgeable or recognizable or decipherable, which is then a further fracturing and fragmentation of our perception of the life in which we're living in the built world around us. This is a collage made in 2017 for the suite of sculptures that I made. That one sculpture is a part of the dialogue. One of the things that I wrestle with a lot in the studio and preparing for new projects and ideas is that first series of works that I made in 2017 were a comment on my experience in 2014 when Michael Brown was murdered in St. Louis County. I was making sculptures out of objects that were made in 2014, but then presented in 2017. And then I was using newspaper articles that oscillated between all those periods of time in one. And how does that breath of time, a fragment of time or space, kind of coexist within an object that can continue to live beyond me and beyond the measure of any of those incidents or occurrences that I reference, or myself even living to make the thing.
Thank you so much, Khalil. I'll invite Ramakant to share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Okay, hopefully that can be seen. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Linda, for letting me be a part of this. It's very exciting. What I found about ceramics and fabric is that, well, first, let me begin by saying what you're looking at. Let's start there. What you're looking at are my most recent body of work called Flowered Thorns. And what you're seeing are broken ceramics and fabric woven into sculpture. I also use, at the very bottom here on the left, you can see some coffee bean bags that I have unraveled to add to the sculpture, because it's burlap, and I think of coffee bean bags as a symbol of labor, because someone has to go and grow those beans, and someone has to go and plant and take care of those beans and harvest those beans. And these are all, coffee, which is all black and brown regions of the world that's been harvested. So I figured, as a symbol of labor, I'd also add, like the fabric itself, which is also a symbol of labor, because usually fabric is made predominantly from black and brown women around the world. So I owe a great deal of thanks to people who have expertise beyond my skills, because I don't weave nor dye my own materials. And I also am grateful to Tony Marsh and Christopher Miles, Ian Hazard-Bill, and Dino Capaldi for allowing me to have their shards. So the whole idea of a collaboration, of weavers, ceramicists, and then myself to make the work. So when it comes to the whole idea of fragment and dissonance, what really resonated with me is the statement about the theme of the discussion for the seminar is experiencing the world through fragments is characteristic of the diasporic experience. And I live that every day. That's part of my genes. So how do I create something or bring something into the world that symbolizes, I hope you can see the label, there you go, that symbolizes my experience. So when it comes to symbolic language and speaking abstractly and metaphorically, I see ceramics as a stand-in for my experience of being Black and queer in America, broken, discarded, marginalized, minimized, and then the fragments of the fabric and textiles. I grew up in a textile family. My father and mother both worked in a textile mill in North Carolina called Haynes Knit. and they used to be in North Carolina. Now I think they're offshore for now. And then the whole idea that everyone is wearing fabric, and fabric is more universal than any other material, in my opinion. It's particularly more universal than oil on canvas, because there are very few people that walk around wearing an oil painting as a garment, but we're all wearing fabric. So I was trying to, use these two elements and to, as a metaphor for the Black queer experience and the African diasporic experience, or any experience of other or otherness. That's how we're characterized by the dominant culture, is to be perceived as other. So, and then the symbolic associations that I have with shards is that it is a symbol of brokenness. So throughout one's life, one has to accept brokenness from the minute we're born to the minute we die, because we're always degrading. We're always being fragmented. We're always losing something just to live, because our bodies are constantly aging. And you have to experience and understand and accept what that means. And the acknowledgement of self. So accepting fragmentation is, for me, a very powerful way of navigating a very hostile environment and a world. So these are all the things that I bring to the work that I create. I'm sure a lot of people, when they see these images or when they see my work, particularly if there's a lot of them, they unconsciously reference brokenness. And I want to reach people on that level of the unconscious, because that's what we all are acting on, whether we understand it or not. We're all driven by our unconscious, if you believe the science and history of psychology and psychiatrists. And to tap in, not to my experience. How do I create a universal experience so other people can experience and acknowledge their own pain, their own unhappiness, or whatever feelings they have about brokenness? And my whole thing is, I don't throw these away. They're shards and broken, but I don't throw them away. So I keep them and I create something beautiful out of it. Otherwise, we are socialized to discard anything that's broken, unless we have the skills to repair it. We're more inclined to go out and buy something else. And I'm saying, if you are beautiful when you are intact and not broken, then you are beautiful when you are broken. And then let that, and our power in fragmentation, I think, is what has helped people of color and marginalized peoples around the world be able to survive in a very hostile environment. So a lot of these symbols, I'm speaking very personally here, in that how do I create sculpture that can manifest people's experience beyond my own? My experience and my pain is mine. How do I translate that into something beautiful? Something people can relate to, not on my experience, but on something quite universal. We all have our pain. We all have our brokenness. We all feel thrown away and in an other, as an other in many situations throughout our lives. And then I feel as though that's something to be acknowledged, something to craft and maintain. And also to be a part of a global, as an African-American, queer African-American, is to acknowledge that my experience did not start with slavery. Black and brown people were the first. So when it comes to the history of the Black experience, it's 300,000 years old. It did not start with the beginning of the slave trade. And that's fragmentation, because we've been fragmented and our culture is continuously being fragmented. And that's where I put these pieces and the work that I create in a context that's speaking to larger, more dreamlike symbolisms and concepts. So I don't know, have I gone over my 5 minutes?
It's perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So when we stop sharing screen, we'll be able to reconvene. And I am really moved by the resonance that happens between the conversations. You know, it started to appear as I was getting the pieces of writing, but as you speak of it today, it's just so immediate how much inheritance and ancestors and lineage, and also how we, as a group, renegotiate labor. Rose brought up process and that idea of refining that grace through the slab process of making a physical embodiment of being very present. And I think that that opens up the question, how much does that offer, that the processes that you gain and that you invent through your making, how does that link in with your relationship with the past and with things that you want to change in the future?
Is this for me?
I'll start with Rose, yeah.
It's Khalil.
I mean, I'll take it if you want me to take it.
It's for all of you.
Go for it.
Well, you know, in some ways, I think right now I'm trying to still learn so much about some of the things that I'm doing, and some, like, even though I have spent many years like dealing with certain processes and practices, how things continue to evolve and change and transform, things can be done differently. So I think for me, I'm still in a state of learning, and I'm still learning through my process and learning through the possibilities of things as we see, like Tesla is like making the electric cars and they're using lithium in a different way. They're mining cobalt around the world and they're using that to then make different things. Like, how then could that also affect, I mean, that affects our prices in the shop when we go to buy materials, but how does that also affect what we're able to be doing in the studio? So I think in a lot of ways, I'm working on making more room in the studio to be in a place to recognize all the possibilities, and maybe in the near future, I'd be able to be a little bit more confident in some of the parts of what you're asking.
Rose?
I really like seeing Ramakan and Khalil's work, because I sort of project myself into that process, like looking at the details and those, finding, familiarity in that moment of investigation and almost quiet or loud intuitive listening, right? In that moment of allowing, the moment of questioning and then daring to allow. And that in itself, I feel, is incredibly powerful and validating, and to see like those details of like the spun string or that moment of crush, and feeling that inside of myself, and the reflection of the ability to dare to do that and to make that decision, that choosing is that creation, right? Is that creating force. And I think about the silence and innovation and how much listening it takes to allow, and how much listening within and watching and witness and wonder in order to sort of pull those tools together to be the person that you need to be, and the being that is brave enough to do this, and then seeing when others like Linda, when seeing that courage and that excitement. Linda reminds me of the excitement of building, and that the reflection of when that piece looks back at you and you learn something, and in that learning you realize that you're putting that out there in the world, something that never existed before, and in that's creation. And those fragments, you're watching them and seeing them spin together and create this whole that is so beautiful because it's so dynamic. I just think about innovation and how that's so linked to courage and intuition, and the courage to look deeply at our own intuition, which is a really, really beautiful thing. And I just feel so blessed this morning to see all of your work, and just to it makes me want to get back to work, but I'm excited to talk to you about it too.
Me as well. I, as you talk about intuition, I'm thinking of something Ramakant said about working with the shards and how private a process that is. How you said, Ramakant, I don't want other eyes on this process. So when we're working with issues that are so internal and so raw, can you talk a bit about what kind of aesthetic grows from that? Like you have talked about rejecting classical beauty. How does that kind of privacy and intuition then find itself in aesthetic? And before you answer that, Ramkhan, I'd like to invite the audience listening to go to your Q&A, and you're able to type in questions so we can open the floor up to your questions as well. So the Q&A will welcome your questions at this time.
Well, thank you, Linda. For me, we have to have and be courageous in our time alone to be able to have. So for my studio, it's like a sanctuary. It's where I don't have to. There are no eyes. It's like being in the Black church, where everyone in the Black church experience. Once you're able to be who you are within the church, that sacred space, because that once you leave that space, you can't be who you are once you leave the church. But and all the eyes are outside, but they're not on the inside. So you can let go of having to decode or having to smile, or having to step and fetch, or having to pretend. So my studio is a sanctuary. And to be, the idea of like classical, you used to mention my comment about classical beauty. The classical beauty was never designed to include me. Man, my nose is too big, my lips are too thick, all that, right? My skin is too brown. Classical beauty was not designed to include me. So when it comes to me creating beauty, I need to create beauty in a way that subverts that type of mindset. And I can do that not when I'm being watched. I have to be very vulnerable, because at the same time I'm drawn to the culture that I grew up in. I'm also rejecting it, and it's constantly happening because it's a mirror that the culture sees a mirror of me, and it's not a mirror with a smile. So I have to be able to bring that self-acceptance of who I am and my creativity and my idea of what it is to be an artist in America. I have to internalize that in a positive way. And it's easier for me to do that when I'm not being watched. And I feel as though Black America, any culture, that's in a violent, hostile environment, we're always being watched. Our ancestors are being watched, even from the grave, they're being watched, I feel. So the whole idea of having eyes on me, I know there's a lot when you asked about the idea of not having people in my studio. I feel as though, when I'm working, I feel as though that it's not personal. It's just that I feel as though that I can't be authentic if I'm always being watched. And once I leave the studio and go out into the street, there are cameras everywhere. There are cameras that can watch us from the sky, and can also identify us from the top of our heads. So the idea of, well, how can one be authentic and courageous if we're always being watched? I think that was part of your question, I think. Did I leave anything out?
Thank you so much. No, that's it brings up so much. Would our other panelists like to ask questions? Rose suggested going with the flow, and I love that. So as Claire Toomey joins us now for the Q&A, I'd also like to invite the panelists to ask questions or to respond to what was just said. It's very powerful.
I mean, I've been working for many years within schools or like some kind of institutional setting. And now I've moved home full time to St. Louis, and I'm spending time building my own studio. So I don't, in some ways, you could think about being in an institution as like building a relationship, unhealthy or healthy relationship, or being dependent or independent or codependent within that space. And I've been trying to figure out what does it, well, I have had no choice to move home to St. Louis. So what does it mean to build a studio from the bottom up, and the infrastructural things that you need to be able to survive? What can you make without? And does that change the physicality or the point of departure that you can engage in from a place with a certain set of resources or possibilities? And does that fracture away from a certain way of knowing or being also allow you a certain openness to operate in a completely different way? And is there something else that's born out of that? And so for me, a lot is being born out of being in my own space without the eyes. Even though when I was in teaching with Linda at Alfred University, our doors were always open for the most part. And so people would see us even in our most vulnerable state. But in a lot of ways, I think in those rooms, it was always also about sharing. And I think in a like thinking about this place of being heard or dealing with the things that we've inherited or the positions in which we're in, with or without the diverse possibilities of what privilege can see or be seen as, in a place of hurt, or a place of loss or lack, we're also still very giving. We're still very open to the possibility of positive change and growth. And I think in dealing with the things that I've inherited and learned from my family or society, and still wanting and desiring to have my own space to work on my own outside of an institutional setting, it's still very much a desire. There's still very much a desire to share and give, and the community changes, the context changes, the fragments of what I'm working with or the parts of what I'm working with are shifting. The community is shifting, but the issues and the problematics that push it forward are still quite similar. Rose, how do you feel living at home and building the studio and being in a lot of ways? I want to ask, are you away from other people your own age that are also invested or working through ideas or construction methodologies that are similar to your own? For me here in St. Louis, I feel a bit lonely because I feel like the people that I want to be in conversation with are all over the place. And being here in this specific location, it's very much me and my grandmother and family, but it's not the kind of intellectual family or the material family that is so much embedded within what we know and learn as the ceramics too.
I've been going through that loneliness, I think, recently of, I don't know, I think some of us choose to have a foot in a lot of different worlds. And that's like this very fragmented life, that I speak a lot of languages, and I have so many different communities, that being like the Pueblo here in Santa Clara, even like my deep investment and involvement in car culture. That's a whole language and group of people that don't speak the language we're speaking here, don't end up in these circles, don't end up in my tribal circles, my friend groups and people, comrades that I met in school or in professional situations who I care for deeply. We're all sort of in these very different trajectories, and we're like these trains headed in different directions, and there is something very lonely about the investment, the deep investment in your investigation, I think. But I think that when I do connect with people, that it is very meaningful, and that it has a deep impact. And I think a lot of us who spent a lot of time at home for the past 2 years and didn't have a lot of that social engagement because we were, in quarantine, etc., that I think we got, like, I would speak for myself and I hear from other people that our sensitivities got increased, almost like our social sensitivity got more intense, or like you go out into the world for, you go into the city for a couple hours and you need like a week to rest and to process what you experienced and to really deeply revisit and understand the messages that were given to you in these intense moments of connection. And so I feel like being out in the boonies and the res, sort of away from the city life and going to, like, coffee shops and hanging out with people, that there becomes an intensity to the messages that I receive when I receive them and the connections that I have. And I'm trying not to give them a value judgment, like good or bad, or to feel like a victim. I want to stay in my agency, in my life, and to find how moments like these can really build, because we're, I don't think we ever weren't in a fragmented reality. I think the truth is being more unveiled more than ever, and those feelings of disconnect and that the sound of a disharmony is more clear than ever. But I think it's actually, we're finding the truth of the reality of our human existence, that the denial is eroding and we're coming into a deeper awareness of our true reality, which I think is a blessing.
A total blessing, even in its in its isolational loneliness.
Yeah, like a fragment of place even. And I just have this image of, what Ramakan was describing, being seen and observed from above, from around. I see this kind of 3D scan of how, like, when it gets all glitchy and there's only parts, and there's parts that can't be filled in by the outside. Those can only be nuanced in an internal way or in an intuitive way. Claire is joining us, and I'd love to open the floor to questions, and from Claire.
There's a really interesting question here from Abby, and it may or may not connect with this exact conversation, but it seems to, I feel like from what you said, it will really connect in some way. She's asking about scale. When does a fragment become so small, eroded, or a granular substance, or so large, an object with a minuscule scratch or chip off its surface, to not be considered a fragment anymore? When is, that's, I'm looking forward to seeing your response to scale. Like,
I'm thinking about clay. Clay is like a tiny, like little, like, geometric planar form. And so it's like layered and stacked on each other that make the material in which we can work with. And I mean, I feel like Rose's works are a larger scale representation of what clay particles look like. So it's like, I think it's like a constant micro and macro viewingship of the material, but also the issue, or the things being mined from the earth is like a micro image or a microscopic scale of something. But then how we apply it to like, I've never been to this place, but Linda's been, Boston Valley Terracotta in Buffalo, New York. Some of the projects that they take on, so they start to make the architectural ornament look like scales. And so how is that not a very similar form to the microscopic clay? It's almost like we just, like, we're really in a hall of mirrors, it seems like, or a hall of mirrors, where things are, they are what we know them as and the way we see them as, but they're constantly mirroring each other, but maybe just at different sizes.
I'm interested in our perspective of it. So, like, I think that I can feel very unified, or I can feel very fragmented from, depending on my attitude. So I think like what Khalil was saying is the subject. So, you know, I think that the earth could feel fragmented from the galaxy, right? Or it can feel one of, depending on the perspective that you're holding, the intention. So in the end, it's very much intention. To me, the intention of what you're putting into it. Or is it whole, or is it a piece? Are we victims, or are we in our agency?
And for me, that goes back to your kind of call for listening as well, Rose. Very interesting, you know, the perspective of how we listen and when we listen.
The idea of a fragment and the question of, you know, when is a fragment no longer a fragment, or when is a fragment is still a part of the, I mean, once something, a fragment usually I think of as a shard is something from something else. So if it's already, you know, I mean, our whole bodies are full of cells that are built on top of each other. There's trillions of cells, but not one of them, not just one, does not make a human body. Right? So the whole idea of, like, you know, of having bazillions of one cell in our bodies creates the human being or any other object. But so it can be really small, or it can be really big. And you can even be a shard of a shard of a shard of a shard. They exist. But as an artist, what shards do I use? How do I select what's too small or what's too big? Well, what's too small is that if I can't get that shard to have the edges come out at the audience in a way that's dynamic, it's too small. You know, I have a lot of small shards here, but they don't, you know, so I want that tension. So that's how I select them. That tension has to be there. That sharp edge has to be out. That's how I feel, sharp. It has to be out. So that when you see 20, 30 shards, you know, and they're large, they are symbolically suggesting danger. And I think and that's how I feel that, even though some people may not be able to articulate it in the way that I'm expressing it, but I use shards as a way to acknowledge that as an individual, I find that danger is everywhere. And now people are seeing danger everywhere. They're privileged of being able to be able to avoid danger because of your privileged status is no longer possible. So if he's asking, he or she, or they are asking about how I select, which shards do I select, and how I select them as fragments, and why, that would be my answer.
Thank you, Ramakan. I think that it's just really interesting, the kind of conversation around the question. And we have another question that, in a way, you may have answered already, but it feels like we have this opportunity in this series to think about, well, Linda will know I'm a little obsessed with white clay quite a lot of the time. But in this conversation about fragments, what I guess I'm asking you from the question here, from, excuse me if I pronounce this badly, but Rufus, about ceramic fragments. I suppose that I'm interpreting that as a way of the materiality. Can you talk to us a little bit about the materiality of the ceramic in this idea of fragment?
To me?
To all of
you.
Starting with you, Ralph.
Are you looking right at me?
I am. I'm looking right
You're looking at all of us in the same. So I was like, the materiality of it. I feel so that ceramics is, and I'm not a ceramicist, but I select, I like the ceramics that people give me because the material of the materials is so dynamic in a way that broken glass doesn't work in the same way. Even if it was studio glass, it doesn't have the same visceral. I mean, ceramics has this very visceral. You know, you can just tell the different. It just has a whole nother. And it's raw, and it's like it could be. It could be. Like you mentioned, myosin porcelain is very thin. It's very difficult to fire. As it's but the materiality of porcelain is very different than the type of material I'm working with, and the message is very different. I mean, porcelain is all about being refined, being elegant, and myosin was used as a material for diplomacy in the with among diplomats. So for me, materiality has to be a bit visceral, primal, raw, and clay and ceramics, at least some of the ceramics that I have, can imbue that so that people can feel it. They may not be able to understand what they're feeling, but they are not allowed just to be indifferent. There's something that it has to draw them to have some feeling.
To be honest, Claire, when you ask that question, I think about your big installation in the museum. I think, and how do you kind of continue to steward those objects through the world and through life?
And almost I would reply with Ramakan's answer. It's a very beautiful triangular moment, because it is about that rawness, and that I have a real sense of kinship with clay and the domestic object. And somebody wrote about it beautifully in one of the shattered works that I'd made about we associate broken china with the home, good or bad. It's so yeah. But now I'm going to throw that question right back at you, Kyle.
But I make everything, all the forms that are facilitated within my sculptures, I make them in my studio. So I'm using hobby molds that I've bought from different people from around the way. I'm 3D printing forms to make molds of them, to cast them. I'm mixing up casting slips and slurries with like a lot of grog in it to try to make clay look like concrete. And the viscerality of how I've kind of evolved to this place has like been really interesting, because it all started by making drawings of New York City in a constructed perspective in 2011. And I just see it all being like a step pyramid closer to where I've gotten to where I am. And it's never not been a part of the abstract. It's never not been the capacity of trying to decipher the complicated realities in which we're commenting on in this conversation. But then how do you put them together to make an object? The only place that, like, I could also make all of my work out of bronze, and I could have somebody hand paint the bronze with enamel. But the historical significance and the problematics of the architecture of what I'm doing is all having, and it's all been scaffolded from the myriad of parts of what ceramics and what clay and where it comes from is, and its applications is the most important. Like, it's what makes, like, if it wasn't for all those things, I don't necessarily think I would be making the sculpture object specifically that I'm making. And so even though it's so specifically engaged and like produced in the studio. It's like I'm like a musical producer. I'm like playing with the levels and like playing with the deck board to make sure you get the whole nice sound. So when you see the object, you're seeing it all full. But I still get that same sense of aha and like ecstatic pleasure when the kiln opens. And so the material is always, and like Rose shared earlier, it's always giving back to me that continues to make me invest more heavy in the viscerality of what the material pursuits can be.
That's such a beautiful description of the relationship with this material. Rose, I wonder, I think if we could push the question to you in terms of this ceramic material, and then I think Linda's going to chuck me off because we're short on time.
I work with, metal and leather and fabric, and I recently did a big where I cut the originals out of wood with a chainsaw, and that was a whole other way of working. And more and more I go into the studio and I pick up the clay, and I remember my friend, my ancestral language, and I think there's been times in my life where I was like, no, I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna like exotify or objectify myself culturally into this relationship with material, and then I go, yeah, this is inherited relationship. It's a language. I was taught to speak from a really young age, and it listens. I think that I have a way of communicating, and it sounds cheesy, and I've tried my life to figure out how not to make that sound cheesy, because it really satisfies the stereotyping of Indigenous people, especially Pueblo people. And going to study in Japan sure puts that in perspective, that we actually have a very young relationship with clay in context, but I'm still grateful for, I have been thinking so much about witness and about listening, and the ability to listen in a state of wonder without judgment. And I really feel that clay sort of teaches me. It's almost like an elder, and in my relationship I have to check myself and come with respect and ask in a state of, I am a guest eternally and perpetually in this life, and the clay constantly teaches me to remember that. And so I feel it listens, I feel it hears me, and when it hears me, it actually documents our conversation. And when it's fired, that conversation is now an intention, an investment in the future that will then be forever. That's there until it gets ground down by natural causes, until it becomes sand again. But that intention becomes a part of building our entire reality. And that's a lot of responsibility, and there's a lot of accountability, and it's something that we have to be careful not to be sloppy with, to be more conscious and thoughtful around. And I'm grateful for that reminder. Does that answer your question?
Thank you so much. That is the most beautiful way to end our conversation today. I want to thank our panelists, Rose Simpson, Khalil Irving, Ramakant O.R. Wisters, and Claire Toomey, and the whole University of Westminster team, partnering with NYU, and Kevin Zhao for being our NYT technical wizard. Really appreciate all of you joining us. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Be sure to join us for our next panel, and Claire's going to throw that up on the screen as we all leave. But it'll be the last week of June. And we have 2 panels at that time. And I hope this opens up conversation for all of us as we go into our lives. We will be taking all the questions. Everyone's screenshotted attendees. We'll share that with the panelists, so we'll continue our conversation in the future.
Thank you.
Yay! Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.